Sweet. Excellent. Okay, well, we're live and we're recording, and this is our panel for podcasting with Massive Damage Adventures as part of RPG Alliance Con. So thank you to the organizers, Vicky and Trevor and everybody else working on the con to get us here. That's fantastic. Really excited. I am Merrick Moyer. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the game master, dungeon master, editor, hoster of the Massive Damage Adventures podcast, which does monthly actual play one-shot games, and have been doing so for 2 or 3 years now. And we're wrapping up our 3rd season right now, with the 4th season starting in January. With me, I have 2 of my players and very good friends. Grace, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello. I am Grace Struth. My pronouns are she, her. I've been playing with Massive Damage Adventures ever since the very first episode. Wizarding Fate was so good and got sucked in from there and volunteered for pretty much every game after that. Yeah, super enjoy it. Been really privileged to be part of it this whole time.
And I am Ross Rideout, pronouns he, him. I've been playing in Massive Damage Adventures from the 4th game in season 1, but I've been playing games with Merrick for somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 years. I can't remember exactly when it started, but it's been a while. Mostly experienced in Pathfinder, a few different versions of Dungeons and Dragons, and the Star Wars RPG from Fantasy Flight Games, but played a little bit of a lot of other games and systems as well.
Yeah, and the fun thing about these 2 guests with me are that they are both 2 of my DMs for games where I get to play. So thank you for that. As dungeon masters yourselves, you know that a lot of times you're running the game and not playing, and I do a lot of running the game, so I really, really appreciate you 2 and the work that you put into the games that I get to play. Thank you.
And we appreciate all the work that you do, which is way more.
A lot of work. I think that you probably put in more work per game that you run than I've put in all of the games that I run put together.
So for format, we are going to talk a little bit about the podcast and some stories and stuff that we've done there. People listening can throw questions into the chat and we will answer those as we see them. And for people listening, we also have 2 giveaways, thanks to the wonderful partners that RPG Alliance has lined up. So thank you to those game companies as well. If you put a question in, you'll get added to a list and we'll do a roll and maybe you win something. What we have are digital copies of one digital copy of the Icarus board game by Hunters Entertainment, a cooperative civilization building game where you stack dice, and a digital copy of Alice is Missing, a silent role-playing game by Renegade Games and Hunters Entertainment as well. And the premise is really cool. That's one I backed on Kickstarter. It's where someone has gone missing in a small town and you're all playing the friends and family of that character, Alice. So I guess a little bit about the podcast and how it got started. 3 years ago, actually, I'm going to start again. 5 years ago, I was living here in Edmonton, Alberta, and I was playing tons of games with my friends. But then my family and we decided to move to Vancouver Island, and we moved away from pretty much everybody we knew, and we had a couple of friends and family out on the island that we were moving towards. And we spent 2 years out there. And some of our games that had been going on while we lived in Alberta continued remotely, and some of the games fell off, and sometimes we lost that close connection with friends when you move away. We spent 2 years out there, and when we moved back to Edmonton, I had this amazing idea. I figured we need to play games with all of these friends again. I also have so many games that I have never played. So why don't we set up a monthly game night where we do a different one shot every time? And the goal there was to, see all these friends, do a potluck, play the games that I hadn't played before. And my secret ones, my 2 or 3 secret ones were be a better game master, put out a podcast. So start recording these, see what happens, and get super rich and famous.
And you'll remember your players that have stuck with you on that last one, right?
I mean, of course. So we're still working on getting rich and famous, all of us together as podcasters and gaming folk. But yeah, so it started off as a monthly potluck where we would get together and we would play some game, and I would provide pre-generated characters in the story, but they would know the game that they were coming into. And it started off with about 20 or 30 people that were involved, and the group now is something like 50 or 60. Now that we're into the 3rd season, well, into the 4th season, actually. We're recording the 4th now. Yeah, so Grace, you had the opportunity to be on the first episode. And when we sat down to play Wizarding Fate, I put the mic in the middle of the table and I was like, hey, maybe one day I'm going to make this into a podcast, so I'm just going to record it. That cool. What was that first gaming session like for you and your husband and, sitting around the table doing that?
Yeah, I think I could be wrong, but I think that was one of the very first RPGs I ever did. I think we did a Doctor Who one before you guys moved out to Nanaimo, and I think that was it. So this was I guess my second ever RPG session. And I was like, I don't entirely know what to expect, but like American Gen, always a fun time. So I think it should be good. Yeah, definitely did not expect it to be what it is today, going into season 4. It was just oh yeah, we'll record this, it'll be fine, nobody will ever hear it, maybe we'll listen to it in 10 years and be like, haha, look how much fun we had.
We were so funny.
So silly. But yeah, and yeah, for me at the time it was just, let's get together with some friends, have some good food, play Harry Potter, which yeah, you had me at Harry Potter, so
and then Ross, like you mentioned before, you your first one in with Massive Damage Adventures was the 4th one, which was Tolis the Shadow Ball.
Yes.
Which that was the first game where the idea came from a player, not from me. So our first 3 episodes were the Hogwarts Fate, where I was like, okay, I want to do Hogwarts. Second one was Star Wars, where I wanted to do a 7 Samurai type thing in the Clone Wars. The third one was Wheel of Time, because I love Wheel of Time. And then the 4th one was actually your suggestion. So why?
Well, it's, I can't remember exactly when you started asking these questions and if I knew about Massive Damage Adventures coming up ahead of time as to why you were asking about these. But, you sent me the message at some point, are there any games you've been wanting to play? And there was no particular reason, but the one game I had always wanted to play is one where I could be an assassin who wasn't a stealth around and stab you in the back type assassin, but instead was a disguise and bluff assassin who would get in close with you and stab you in the back, looking you in the eye. And I just always wanted to play that game, and I always wanted it to be in like a big masquerade ball type environment, the type of place where he could go in and schmooze with the nobility and get in real close with his target and get the job done and have to slip out. And for like, since we were playing 3.5, that was a game that I wanted to play an assassin in. And it just, the opportunity never came up, because realistically, how often do you get that very specific moment where you can be like, I'm going to be an assassin in a masquerade ball going into character creation? It doesn't really happen. So it was really just, that sounded like a cool role to play with the character, and I'd always wanted to do it, and you asked the question and you made it come true for me.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit about this beforehand, but Grace, this was that game you also got to play in was the first time that you got to play D&D.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had always wanted to play D&D, like even as far back as high school, but I didn't know anybody who played. So I was like, I guess it'll just never happen for me. And then you were like, who wants to play D&D? And I was like, pick me, please. And yeah, then I sat in on that game, and actually, Ross, like your character was mind-blowingly good, just the way the narrative was like shaped around him, but there was still so much room for the other characters around that. I was like, man, what an amazing story to be able to tell with your friends and like create this thing together. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so as a result of that game, I'm now a little bit obsessed with D&D, and I play in a bunch of campaigns and I run a campaign, and so I blame you, Merrick.
No, you blame Ross. That was what that story was about.
All right, I blame both of you.
I've got to give mad props to Merrick on that one, because of the way that you were able to take my idea for a game, but then develop all of these little individual goals. Because anyone who hasn't listened to the podcast or wasn't playing there, the way that it was set up is each player had their own goal going into this ball, and there was a bunch of stuff going on, and it was all framed around like a black market silent auction. And so everyone going in and having their specific mission meant that even if the characters weren't part of the same party and weren't trying to accomplish the same thing, everyone could get to their goal and accomplish what they wanted to do, intersecting with the other stories. It ended up being like a Love Actually type story, where there's just like all of these intersecting story arcs for individual characters, and it was just amazing the way it was put together.
Thank you. And for anybody who's interested in the TOLA setting where we did this, Monty Cook Games just earlier in the year ran a Kickstarter reprinting the game into 5th edition in Cypher. So that's actually coming out later this year, or well, in 2021. And we have a question from the chat. First one from Andrew. And so he says, I love the innovation and unique approach you use. Do you feel like you lose much by switching systems, characters, and storylines each episode? And so I would say not too much, because we also switch players. Every group is different every time. We've had a couple of repeats where we've gone back, for instance, with Star Trek, because we were getting review copies from Modifius Entertainment. And so that crew has come back a couple of times. But every time we sit at the table, it's fresh and different. So I think we only have the challenges that one-shots always have, that you just don't have enough time with your characters. Everybody wants to play more. What do you guys think?
Well, what I like about the one-shot style system that we do with Massive Damage Adventures is because, like, you go through campaigns with the same characters for months or for years, however long that campaign lasts, and you're really tied into this character and you want them to keep going through. But with these one-shots, you get an opportunity to create someone completely new and play them in a new situation. And what happens at the end of the session doesn't really matter as long as you give it your all during that session. So your character could die, your character could live, they could have accomplished their mission, fail, create enemies, make friends. It doesn't really matter. It's the story you're telling in that session that makes it all come together. And it's a really unique situation where you can give it that all without necessarily worrying about the consequences of an ongoing campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's really nice to actually get to try a number of new games as well. Like the vast majority of these I would never be able to try in any other way. And some of them, like, we absolutely fell in love with. Like my husband Matt and I, we played the new Numenera episode. And as a result of that episode, he has bought just about all of the books. He's running his second campaign now, both of which I played in as well with a bunch of our friends. And he would have never had the opportunity to do that, but he's able to discover this new setting and this new style of gameplay that he really likes. He loves the Cypher system. I quite enjoy it as well. So it's just really nice to have that variety and get to try new things. And yeah, with a campaign, you are, like Ross was saying, you are locked in for quite a long period of time, which is not a bad thing. And like all of us have the campaigns that we play on the side as well, but it's just nice to have a little something new, just to kind of keep things fresh and interesting.
So is there a particular game, start with Grace, that that you maybe played or didn't play on the podcast that you think is the best, the one that you would recommend to the most people or you would play the most often?
I mean, Tolis aside, because obviously just D&D. One that I really enjoyed was Gods of the Fall. So I believe that was a Cypher system one as well. But getting to have superpowers, like that was quite enjoyable. I remember really enjoying Fragged Empire as well. That was quite fun, just that setting. And a really weird one, kind of out of left field, was Baron Munchausen. I was not expecting to love that one as much as I did, but it was so much fun. And I was saying to Matt afterward, I was like, this is an RPG that you could totally play like on a road trip.
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't actually need pencil and paper for it.
And that's one fun thing that we got to do this season was 2 guest GMs. So Baron Munchausen was actually a game that my friend Justin Bell brought in to run for us because he's a history buff and he thought that it would be a lot of fun. And it wasn't one that was on my radar at all. And then my wife Jen ran a D&D game where she wanted to have us sit down and knows nothing about our characters. And we would discover our character sheets as we played. Ross, so did you have a favorite?
I've had a lot of favorites. Definitely my favorite game was Shadow Ball, not necessarily favorite system, but that was my first time playing 5e. And I'd say that out of the 3 editions of Dungeons and Dragons I've played, 3.5, 4th edition, and 5th edition, 5e is definitely my favorite. So I highly recommend 5e. But also the Star Trek game that you had mentioned before, where if your thing is Star Trek and if you like it, highly recommend that game because it's just so much fun playing in a system where everyone knows that the setting isn't really combat oriented. It's a different type of play than you're used to if you play Pathfinder or 5th edition where there's a lot of combat. Instead, this is a game designed around finding other ways to accomplish your goals, and the Star Trek setting is perfect for it, and the way that the system works, I really like it for that. So highly recommend that one if that's the kind of game you're interested in.
Yeah, and Ross plays Chief Dr. Lieutenant Doc PhD, a Ferengi medical officer in Starfleet.
I sure do.
Which is a wonderful character who loves smooth jazz.
Smooth jazz, modern disco, yeah.
We got another question. This one from Jason. How often does I'll use my ability, oh wait, that's not this game, happen? And for me, sitting behind the screen, literally the screen now in this time of social distancing, I find that it happens a lot to me when I'm thinking about player resources in games, whether I'm doing fate points, plot points, story points, all those little things that players have, like Devil's Bargain and Blades in the Dark, the things that players have to modify their roles and their successes, fails, whatever. Those sometimes get muddled in my head because there's a lot of very similar systems that are different. What about you two? Does, jumping from system to system kind of have you pulling out things that are more familiar accidentally?
I don't think so. It's more like referencing those things. If I'm like, oh, okay, this ability that I have, I don't really understand it. Is it similar to this one in this game that we played? And then it can be like, well, no, it's not 100% like that. It's actually more like this. And it's more just creating a foundation to ask those questions from. There's not so much confusion, I find, which is nice.
I also find that for me, with the games I've played in, it hasn't come up much, just because a lot of the games and the systems that I play in Massive Damage Adventures are so different, and the characters are so different, and you're going in and you're learning the system on the fly. Like the first time that you sit at the table in front of your character. So it doesn't really happen to me much in Massive Damage Adventures with the one-shots. It happens a lot more with ongoing games, in particular Pathfinder, across multiple different Pathfinder campaigns, and a little bit with 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, because there are so many similarities between D&D and Pathfinder. Those are the two for me that I find I kind of get confused sometimes about what character does what.
Yeah. So let's see. I think I want to talk a little bit now about, oh, hang on. We have one more comment. This was again from Andrew, who did the first question. One-shots are really cool. It's almost like a short film instead of an ongoing series. Totally different storytelling potential. Yeah, absolutely. And I take that a little quick second. That reminded me of the thing that I was going to say. Our format, when we sit down to game for these, has a crash course of the rules every time. That's, it's recorded, but it doesn't make it into the podcast. Usually the first 30 minutes of one of our sessions, I'm running the players through all of the specific rules, and then we're refreshing that during game. I don't actually expect any of the players to come in experts on the game. I just want them to sit down, have an idea of their character, and have fun.
To add to that, a lot of times we actually don't even see the characters before we sit down at the session either. So every once in a while, there's an opportunity to get your character in advance, or by special request, sometimes we can help make our own characters, which is awesome when that happens. But thank you so much, Merrick, for putting in all of the work of creating the characters when pre-gens aren't provided with the game. But yeah, like you're learning the system and learning the character for the very first time, sitting at the table in that first half hour.
Yeah, actually for some games, Merrick also sets up spreadsheets for us so that we can pick like character type and whatnot. Like if we're playing in the Cypher system, you can pick like your focus and your descriptor in there. So then you get to see like all the options available and then just tick off whichever one you want. And that makes it super easy for everybody. And then you know in advance.
Mm-hmm. Let me see. One thing that I will definitely say as part of that, as part of this podcast, I have basically been learning 2 new RPGs every month for the last 3 years. Most of the time it's been like in the first year it was 1, but then we were privileged and awesome and lucky enough to be approached by Modifius to become to join their press list and to start getting some review copies. Our first game was for John Carter of Mars to do a review of that. And more games have started coming. So we do 1 episode a month and then we do a bonus episode. And so, yeah, I'm trying to learn and teach 2 games a month, along with all the other campaigns that I'm running just for fun. And what I would say to game designers and publishers, when you're doing pre-gens, please do 6. None of this 4. Don't give me 3. Don't give me 4. 5 is okay. Give me 6. There's a lot of times where, you know, you have a 5, 6, or 7 person table and there's just not enough pre-gens. We've got another question. Thank you, Andrew, for throwing questions at us. Please keep them coming. We've got a couple of topics we'll get to, but we're having fun answering your stuff. And everybody else, ask questions. How do you find more players to include? Any tips? For me personally, I just constantly talk about RPGs and how fun they are. And just the energy that I have, I get these people roped in slightly step by step until they're playing. If you look at the Facebook group that I have, our private Facebook group for organizing all these games and everything, started off with, you know, high school friends and university friends, and then their spouses, but then their friends, and then my work friends, and then everybody else are bringing in their work friends, and so on. And just always, I think, being welcoming and saying that it's fun, and if you find it hard, I will help. Because at the end, you're really just offering maybe even just one night of a one night event of fun, just hanging out, playing a game. And I think that role-playing games, telling stories together, and just enjoying yourselves that way is such an easy sell once somebody actually sits down at the table and laughs with you. Grace, Ross, any tips for finding more players?
I mean, I see a lot of the time there are various Facebook groups for various cities, and like in Edmonton, for example, we have Edmonton Girls Ask. And there's always people being like, hey, does anybody play D&D? Like, I'm looking to get into a game, things like that. And you can always hop onto those comment sections and be like, hey, yeah, like I run a game, I run a podcast, like whatever shape that takes, and be like, are you interested in joining?
I don't think I have anything really to add as far as trying to find new people to play. Merrick and Grace covered that is with anything that I could come up with. But what I would like to add is just for retaining players and getting people who might be playing for the first time coming back to the table again. I found that with my games, that like not the ones I run, but anything that I play in, it's a very relaxed environment, and there are a lot of different people who come to role-playing games for different reasons. Some people like to really get into the character and put on a voice, and they do a fantastic job, and they kind of act things out a little bit. And then other people who just like want to play their character, but they're not so interested in doing the voice, and just kind of being accepting and welcoming and accommodating for what people want to bring into their character can go a long way in getting them to come back. Because if they're comfortable playing their character the way they want to play that character, they're going to have more fun than if they feel the pressure to play their character to a certain degree in specific ways.
And comfort and an open environment is important. And I want to really recognize Vicky from RPG Alliance and Matt Hales. A little while ago, they put a video out about safety tools in games. And Vicky and I had some conversations with that. And she was kind enough to send us a whole bunch by mail. It was wonderful. And I've started using them in my games, because giving everybody at the table the social license to say, I am enjoying myself or I am not enjoying myself, makes the game that much better. This con today and all weekend is using the X card, which is a wonderful safety tool that's just allowing somebody to say, this content is not okay, let's rewind. And I've felt that including those in my games has helped me really pay attention to my players more and create the atmosphere that I'm looking for.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually feeling like you're safe enough to say, no, I'm not comfortable with this, even just in a game setting. Like, oh man, that sets a foundation for being able to say it just in everyday life.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, so that's how we play the games and what kind of games we've been playing. I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of the podcast, because we touched on the partnerships with companies and reviews, and that's been really, really cool. I think that one of the amazing things that we've gotten to do recently, I've gotten to do a couple of interviews. So the podcast spoke with Ian Lemke from Green Ronin a little bit ago in August. I've got an upcoming interview with Sean K. Reynolds from Monty Cook Games. And we were recently sponsored by Roll20 for Roll20 Spotlight, which has been really cool. And it's just something that I'm very thankful for. And it's something that I couldn't have done without players like Grace and Ross bringing this wonderful energy to our table and letting me get to play more games with you. So thank you, Ross and Grace.
You're welcome.
For being a part of it. Let's see. Before jumping to some of the questions in the chat, I want to know, with how far we've come in 3 years of doing this, what do you two want to do more of or do new in this podcast?
I mean, there was a game we were talking about playing that I think it got canceled for whatever reason, but we were talking about doing a vampire LARP. And like, really, any kind of LARP would be tremendously fun, just because then we're taking the RPG elements a little more into the real world. I just think that would be tremendous amounts of fun to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the original plan there had been to book a venue and go out and do a full vampire LARP, and then the episode would just be a couple of players sitting down and recapping and chatting and laughing about it. And then it kind of fell apart because I don't have any experience running a LARP, and I left everything a little too late and just collapsed under the pressure. And I was like, I can't do it, guys. I'm sorry.
That's okay. One day, goals.
One day. We have resources. Some of our players are very good LARPers. Yeah. What about you, Ross?
For me, it's definitely more review games. I think that outside of just the joy I have playing the games in Massive Damage Adventure, what I've had the most fun with was specifically the Hyperlight Drifter review game. Playing this game where I believe at the time it wasn't available to the public. Was this before it became actually like widely available?
Yeah, so we were approached by Andreas Walters, who was running the Kickstarter for Hyperlight Drifter at that point, and asked if we wanted to do a review game on a quick turnaround last year. And it was like, yes, that sounds amazing. Let's do it. And so he sent us the stuff and he walked me through how to do it. And we ran the game real quick. And Ross was interviewed as part of the review.
And I absolutely love that experience. I repair equipment as a living, or for a living. And so just like problem solving and finding things that might, like finding what works and finding what doesn't quite work, whether it's just like not necessarily the mechanics don't work as much as maybe more explanation to the mechanics in this particular part might be required. That sort of thing I'm really into. I'm really into that sort of quality control and troubleshooting and just back and forth with the developer and just trying to make this the best thing it can be with what they're trying to do with it. And I absolutely love it and would love to do more of that.
Cool. Well, if there are any of the games on our upcoming review list that you're very keen to review, let me know. And we'll make sure to do that. Yeah. So we've got another question from Jason again. What's your opinion on referential descriptors or referential humor? For example, I shoot lightning at him, Palpatine style. Anybody else want to start?
I enjoy
I got my answer. Yeah.
I mean, because then you can just visualize it. And sometimes you're not able to use the exact language that you want to use. Like, you know, electricity comes arcing from my fingertips and whatever, right? Like in the moment, you're struggling to think of those exact words. So you can just be like, this is what it is. And then everybody's like, oh yeah, that's super cool. Like, I know exactly how that looks. So I see that as just adding a little bit of flavor to the game.
100% what Grace just said. You know, if you can use a reference that other people can visualize, it just cements itself so much deeper into your imagination. You know, if I'm going to play an assassin and I'm going to come up and stab someone in the back, I could say, like, I sneak up and I stab them in the back, but I could also say Assassin's Creed style, and everyone immediately knows exactly what I'm trying to say I'm doing. Love it.
I mean, completely well said with both of you. Not all of us are wordsmiths who are also public speakers. I completely support anything that the players want or need to do to get their point across, to get their adventure shown, to have those moments that make the game fun for them. And I think both examples, Palpatine and Assassin's Creed style, like we can all visualize that and it adds to the immersion most times. I think that there are situations where it probably pulls you out of immersion, but I think that those only on very specific games with very specific like themes and styles. Like if you're playing, I don't know, let's go with Invisible Sun. If you're playing an incredibly surrealist, like cerebral type game, and you're making odd references, it might be a clash. But I think that the clash only happens when it's both the game and the agreed upon theme of the game that are being undermined by the reference. I think for the most part, it's just how we play and how we tell stories with each other. Got another question. Back to Andrew. X-Card and other safety tools, sharing pronouns. What other innovations would you like to see become more popular? One of my favorite safety tools that I'm using in every one of my games is a session zero to establish the expectations of the game master, of the players going forward. One thing that I found really, really successful on the last couple of campaigns I've started was getting the players to write a one-sentence adventure hook that the game master then adds in, because that investment in the game when that player's hook comes up is so fun to watch. And I got a whole bunch of ideas that I wouldn't have thought of. I thought that it was really, really cool. Ross, Grace, anything that you would like to see become more in games?
Sorry, go ahead, Grace.
Oh, that's okay. You sound like you have an answer prepared, so that's perfect.
I 100% forgot whatever I was going to say already.
Oh, no. Okay. Okay, I will chime in then, hopefully give you a second to remember what it was. For me, it's not so much a safety tool or anything, and it's something that I definitely want to use more in my own campaigns. But just checking in with the players after each session to be like, hey, how was that for you? Like, was there anything that bothered you? Anything you particularly liked? Anything that could be improved? And just that one-on-one feedback. I just know with asking the group at large, it's generally a lot of, yeah, it was good. I enjoyed myself, you know, had fun. But it's hard to get really directed feedback. And there's not always going to be feedback from each player. But then if there's something fresh in their mind that they want to talk about, then that just gives them the opportunity to do that. So I definitely want to use that more myself. I'm not sure how feasible that is in something like Massive Damage, where we've got like 60 players, but I mean, a little check-in here and there doesn't hurt, even if they're not playing again for 6 months. So,
for me, I think that the only thing that comes to mind, other than what's already been said, is just inclusivity of other peoples who might not necessarily be around the table at any given time. So like adding more people of color characters into it, adding people where maybe if they're sexual preferences come up in the game, it's not necessarily going to be a heterosexual preference. You know, there's a little bit more broadness to the inclusivity of the characters, whether it's player characters or NPCs. Seeing more of that in the games, I find is really good, not only for taking away the stereotyping of what you imagine within the games, but I also think that it probably helps to some degree in your day-to-day life as well. Just trying to imagine a world with more, like, all of these people in it, because they're there, but you don't necessarily think of it. If you work in a workplace with like all white heterosexual people, that's just where you happen to work at that time. So trying to imagine in your game space more of that within the world you're in, I find it's helpful.
Yeah. I'm from a mixed background, and I want to see more representation in the space all the time. It gives me that little woohoo when I see that kind of story being told. And I try to include that as well in my games as much as possible. And it's something that I keep very front of mind when I'm looking for example, character art to show NPCs to the players. I want to have diversity sort of pre-built in, but at the table, it's not always easy to remember that just because of inherent biases and because of expectations in particularly the fantasy genre. And so I have two tools that I use for that. One of these is the NPC deck by Monty Cook Games, where there's just however many cards, and you can just like pull a card and get a random NPC, and they're already, diverse. And because those are the values that Monty Cook Games puts in their products. And then I also built this little table for myself that has, it's not going to be very, it's a little bit legible. Right down there at the bottom. Basically, I've got a space for 3d8s where I've set this. Basically, the idea was originally the Kinsey scale for sexuality. And so I've got heterosexual on one side, homosexual on the other side. There's a space for asexual, bisexual in the middle. And so I'll roll a die and then just have the NPC have that orientation. And it may come up in the narrative and it may not, but it reminds me to include that whenever I need to just on the spot come up with a character. And then I've also got gender identity, so feminine to masculine and non-binary. And then I've got let's see, feminine to masculine. And then I've got assigned sex at birth, and trans is also included on that. And so I try to randomize results that are going to give me a fuller picture of a sudden random NPC.
And I wanted to mention something you included in our most recent game that we recorded, which is Good Society, coming out soon. Very excited. Was that at the beginning you asked, like, yes, this is a Regency story, but to what extent do we want to adhere to the values and norms of that time? Like, do we want to allow for these differing identities and relationships and things like that? And we all agreed, yes, that's absolutely something we want. And so that actually became a key part of the story, which was very cool to have that representation in there.
So we've got 5 more minutes, and we have another question from Andrew. He says, feel free to skip this question, but of course we won't. We want to talk about stuff. How do you feel about players taking the role of characters with a different heritage culture than the one they grew up with? Could that be cultural appropriation? So from my perspective, defining cultural appropriation to me is when a privileged group is benefiting from something from a marginalized group. So playing a character of a different group wouldn't be appropriation, although there's chances for that in there. And then that can get into fetishization and stereotypes. And I don't think personally that it is an inherently bad thing, because as role players, we are trying to understand experiences other than our own. But the most important thing, especially if you are doing it for the public, especially if you are on a podcast or you're on a Twitch stream, is to be respectful, to understand how stereotypes and how biases are going to impact you, and to create a character that is not just one facet. If you are playing a gay character, gay is not their personality. You need to build more into that person. And I am not a gay man, so I cannot say that with the fullest foundation of strength, but I've had that conversation with people from that group, and that's what they've told me. I think that, once again, touching on performing for other people, I think that in that case, people should be represented by people from that group, especially if it's a marginalized group. In your home game, you're doing your thing. Explore that respectfully. I don't have anything to add until I get more. Ross, Grace, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how valid my opinion is, just because like the only minority group that I come from is female.
I mean, that's a big one to talk about.
Okay.
There's half of the world are them.
Yeah. I don't know. Like I typically do play female characters. That's more just out of a place of comfort, I guess. More because I don't. Yeah. And I'm trying to think of how to explain it, but I feel more comfortable with that personally. Yeah, in terms of other marginalized groups, I suppose if I'm playing a character from one of those groups, I will, as you said, try and make it as well-rounded as possible. Yeah, I think I tend to play those ones a little bit safer, just because I would hate for somebody to be listening to the podcast and then come up with biases or misconceptions around those groups because of the way that I portrayed it. So maybe that's a shortcoming on me, that I will always play it a little bit safer. But yeah, like with Good Society, for example, just as the most fresh example of that, I don't identify as lesbian, but I played a lesbian character. And you know, I did to the best of my ability with that one. So I guess we'll see what people think of that. But the goal was just to create a character who was pursuing love, and her own interests as well at the same time. And yeah, I guess it's more just seeing them as a well-rounded person, as opposed to just focusing on that one piece of it. So acknowledging it without having that be the single defining feature, as you said. I don't know if that added anything or if I just kind of rehashed what you said, but.
So I apologize if I accidentally offend anyone here. I'm going to start this off with one of my favorite scenes out of the remake of The Karate Kid was when Jaden Smith was on the plane and his mom tells him to go practice his, I think it was Mandarin, with a Chinese guy on the plane. And he goes and he speaks in his Mandarin to this guy, and he turns to the kid and he says, "Dude, I'm from Detroit." And so with that in mind, I mostly play white cis characters because I am a white cis male. It's what I'm comfortable with. It's what I know. It's what I know I can play without being offensive, because that is me. However, I have played multiple characters from different ethnic backgrounds. I've played some gay characters sometimes. I've played female characters at least a couple of times. And what I try to do when I play those characters is be the guy from Detroit. Just because I'm playing a character from a different ethnic background does not mean that I'm playing a character from where that background originated. And I find that helps me a lot as a player in not being offensive and still being able to get behind that character, because I'm not bringing in grossly stereotypical accents. I'm not bringing in grossly stereotypical cultural appropriation. In times when I am trying to pull things from the culture of that character, I try to do my research into what it means. So in a recent Massive Damage Adventures game, we played a cyberpunk game, and I actually played a character of Arabic background. This was an American character, so that I didn't have to try to fake an accent or anything like that. But I wanted the character's name to follow Arabic naming syntax. So I did the research into how the syntax works. I looked into some traditional Arabic names, and I came up with a name that was actually just his bounty hunter handle, based on the syntax. I wasn't even making that like that character's Arabic name. It was the name that he chose. He was an American character. I played an African American woman in another cyberpunk game. Actually, I've played a Spanish god in our Gods of the Fall. So I've played characters of those other backgrounds. And for me, what's important to do as a player when I'm attempting to play a character from a background, whether it's ethnic or gender or sexuality that is not me, is just not to make it stereotypical. I want to see where I can pull off of my experience and my research, knowing people like that and looking into those cultural backgrounds, but I'm not going to base the character around that. I'm going to base the character around the personality of the character that I want to play, and also he happens to be Arabic.
Yeah. And to sort of, because we're running out of time, touch on one last thing here from Andrew. The idea that as a GM, you need to be playing diverse NPCs, and sometimes you're just not comfortable getting into that character or voice or into that headspace. And I feel that as well. I want to have diverse representation in my games, and I can't act every one of those authentically. So, building on what Ross said, finding the motivations for the character that build on the story and respond to the players, but aren't rooted in the stereotypes or beliefs that people have about that ethnicity. I mean, build characters that have facets, I think. It's the safest way to go about it.
I would also add to that just being open to criticism from your players, because you're not going to get it right 100% of the time, especially if you don't belong to one of those groups. So, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm not comfortable with the way you did that, or for whatever reason it just didn't work, then just being like, yeah, I acknowledge that. I messed up. I'm going to try and do better next time. And it doesn't have to end the game or the campaign. It's just a learning moment for you is all it is.
Okay. And so we'll quickly do our draw. Oh, Vicky, did you have something to add?
No. I was just going to, never mind. Please do the draw. People want stuff.
Yeah, we've got questions from two people. So, and we got two things to give away.
They're good odds.
So, Andrew and Jason. Andrew's got odds and Jason has evens, and we're rolling for Icarus. And then I think, Vicky, it's fair that then the other person will get Alice is Missing.
Sounds great.
All right. What did I say? Andrew is odd. Sorry, Andrew, you're not odd. That's not what I meant to say.
I like it.
Okay, so we've got a 6 rolled. So, Jason, you will be getting Icarus. And Andrew, you will be getting Alice is Missing.
Okay, Jason and Andrew. Great. Jason and Andrew, I will be in contact with you folks about getting those prizes to you after the convention. We have to just go to the publishers and work that all out. So we'll get those to you as soon as possible. And
Awesome.
I think you have an Android in the Shadow of the Beanstalk game to go to, Merrick.
I got a game I got to run in 5 minutes.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, so Vicky was kind enough to throw the link to the podcast in the chat. But if anybody wants, if anybody's listening to the, I guess if you're watching it on YouTube, because if you're listening to it, you've already gotten to us. Our link is linktr.ee/Skyhammer Press. And you can follow the podcast on Twitter at SkyhammerK.
Thank you so much for the questions.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to thank you guys for like an insightful, honest, and passionate panel. I mean, and you guys are really trying new, innovative things in our hobby, and it's just refreshing to see. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you for letting us come and chat. And really just appreciate your support.
All right. Well, have a great rest of the con and good luck tonight with Android.
Thank you. Ooh.
All right. I'm going to end the podcast now or the feed, and we'll see you later. Android.